She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She didn't even say a word. But the second Julia's breath caught in her throat and her eyes welled up under the blinding stage lights, the entire studio froze. 1 second she was seated beside Brandon, hands tightly folded in her lap, jaw stiff but composed. The next she was standing, walking straight off the tell-all couch like the air had been ripped out of the room. Silent panic, no warning. Not a single castmate moved. The question that broke her, just 4 innocent words. How are you both? That's all it took. Welcome to TLC Drama Files. I'm Oliva. And if you're not already strapped in, hit that subscribe button because this right here is not your everyday TLC storm. We're about to pull apart the moment that shattered months of silence. And none of it is what it looks like on the surface. Drop your take in the comments. Was Julia protecting her peace or hiding something for the wrong reasons? Because we need to talk about what led to this. What made that one question so basic, so painfully routine, snap everything Julia had been holding together with invisible thread? What took a woman who has handled cast squabbles, public backlash, and in-law messiness with a straight face and turned her into someone too overwhelmed to even breathe on stage? The answer isn't the pregnancy. It's not even the high-risk part. It's the fear underneath it, the layered kind. Emotional fear, cultural shame, relationship pressure, and a secret that's been expanding quietly for months. Both inside her body and outside, in the silence that suffocated everything around it. Because this didn't start with a meltdown. It started long before with a decision, a quiet one. Invisible to everyone except Brandon. Back then, she could handle her family not knowing, Brandon's parents not knowing, the cast not knowing, even the audience not yet. She believed holding it in was safer than letting it breathe. Then came the filming, the group dinners, the cameras logged on every micro expression. And Julia kept smiling. Smiling through bloated ankles, through short breaths, through deliberate layers covering a gradually forming bump. Holding that secret like a hostage because deep down she wasn't just afraid of what would happen if people found out. She was afraid of who she'd become if she couldn't pretend anymore. And Brandon knew the minute they walked onto the set that things were starting to fracture. Every time he looked at her, he saw the tight shoulders, the clipped answers. The way her hand would hover too long near her own stomach before she caught it and yanked it away, like even touching the truth might expose her. So why was no one saying anything? Because he was. Brandon was saying nothing. And trust me, when Brandon goes quiet, it usually means something's way too loud behind the scenes. He wanted to tell his parents, sure, he wanted to celebrate. But not at the cost of pushing a woman who was allegedly already living on survival mode. So, he played along, too. And suddenly, everyone was dancing around something no one could name until that couch moment, the lights, that one tiny sharp question, how are you both? And in that second, every buried feeling tore a hole into the room. And then she was gone. Because sometimes it's not the truth itself that breaks a person. It's how long they've kept it from breaking free. There was something off with Julia. The moment she walked into the tell-all house. She had the smile. Sure. The same well-practiced, tight-lipped grin she's worn through fan questions, social media swipes, countless awkward cast dinners. But the eyes didn't land. They scanned too fast. Her arms stayed too close to her sides. She adjusted her shirt 3 times before her name was even called for an intro shot. Whatever she'd come and prepared for, it wasn't casual banter. With people watching her every move. Everyone thought she was playing it cool. She wasn't. She was calculating angles from the jump. Julia's body read like a woman carrying a secret she couldn't afford to let slip out. Her laugh was too quick, her shoulders too pinned. The way she sat, not sunk into the couch, but perched, spine perfect, arms folded, knees together, like she was actively trying to shrink in space she used to own with ease. Camera-friendly, yes. Comfortable, not at all. And when invited to join the girls by the pool, she dodged, complained about heat, said she had cramps, just didn't feel like changing. We've seen Julia in mismatched bikinis with 3 mascara smudges and 0 blush on, sparring with castmates before sunset. This wasn't that, Julia. Then came the jokes. You know the ones. Castmates side-eyeing her. Midsection, mid-laugh, comments flying like, somebody's glowing. That's a pregnancy knows if I've seen one. Don't get me started on your cravings, girl. Julia didn't sweat. She smiled and then it slipped. Oh, this had some work done. Bit of a lift. Nothing wild. Brandon's idea. Cue the cackle. Plastic surgery at months pregnant. But here's the kicker. It worked until it didn't because the people around her weren't clueless. Yara clocked the way Julia kept up her arms folded over her stomach. Like a human gait. Angela noticed when Julia turned sideways and stayed behind furniture in group shots. And Brandon wasn't speaking much at all. But his silence wasn't chill. It was weighed. It was too agreeable, too careful. The man who normally inserts himself into anything Julia related was now standing just behind her literally and emotionally. Like he knew even light pressure would snap her in half. Now. This isn't about bashing Julia's instincts. Let's be real. In some cultures, superstition around early pregnancy is real. Protection from jealousy, evil eye, bad energy. Call it what you will. The point is secrecy equals safety. Especially when the pregnancy isn't textbook smooth, especially when the relationship has had rocky public pass. For her, silence was control. But this wasn't early pregnancy. This was month 6. And what Julia called control had started mutating into isolation. Even her jokes turned stiff. Her sarcasm, once sharp and playful, now felt like armor. She helped castmates with their relationship drama like she had the answers, but never once opened a door into her own. Even a simple how's married life got brushed off like a pothole in the sidewalk. Julia just kept steering conversations toward anything other than herself. And that's when it got obvious this wasn't avoidance for peace. This was avoidance out of survival. Because sometimes secrets don't hide you, they bury you. And bit by bit, people started noticing the cracks. Something about Julia's silence was starting to grow louder than any confession. Brandon didn't flinch under pressure. Not once. Not when his castmates joked about baby names. Not when a producer asked if Julia was feeling okay. Not even when his mother texted him again asking when they'd finally sit down for a proper family update. He read that message 3 times in silence, then locked the screen. On the outside, Brandon played the same relaxed, affable guy people knew from day one. But on the inside, he was boiling under 6 months of squeezed intention and too many half-lives told out of love. At first, it was a decision they made together. Wait until things were more stable. Wait until the next checkup, the next week, the next month. It would feel safer then, calmer. But calmer never came. And neither did the announcement. By month 3, his parents were starting to ask why Julia had gone quiet. By month 4, Brandon said they were just busy filming. At month 5, he told them her phone had been glitchy. Maybe messages weren't going through. Then came month 6. Now he was sitting beside a woman on the edge of panic, desperate to keep her steady, while knowing full well that hiding this from his entire family was going to blow back the second it hit air. He wasn't stupid. He saw the baby-shaped elephant in every room they stepped into. He saw castmates eyeing Julia's shape changes. He saw Angela narrowing her eyes every time Julia shifted her jacket forward to cover her stomach. He noticed the longer pauses Yara gave before speaking. But Brandon made it his full-time job to absorb the heat. If a conversation got too close, he cracked a joke. If someone stared too long, he blocked their line of sight. If Julia looked panicked, he stepped closer. And at first it felt like love. It felt like protection. But then it just started to feel invisible. He wanted to celebrate. He'd pictured this since the day they got that first test result. He dreamed of calling his mom, of seeing tears in his dad's eyes, of finally not being the kid who disappointed everyone. Instead, he was dodging every chance at joy, shrinking beside Julia like a backup dancer to her anxiety. Still showing up, yes, but never forward-facing, never out loud. The distance between them grew in little ways. The half-conversations, the whispered reassurances he wasn't sure she believed. The quiet resentment he buried in the name of being supportive, something he never admitted. A tiny part of him had started to feel punished for being hopeful. And every time he smiled beside her, he swallowed the guilt of loving a moment she was too scared to name. So what did Brandon tell his mom? Nothing. Just we'll talk soon. He said it with a smile, but his stomach twisted every time her name lit up his phone. Brandon tried to be her shield. But a shield takes the hit first. And it was starting to show. In the tell-all house, there are no secrets, just delays. And Julia's was running out of time. It's not the producers with clipboards or the fans on Reddit who expose anything first. It's the cast. People who've lived together under weird lighting and constant surveillance long enough to read a twitch as clearly as a 3-page confession. In this house, body language isn't background noise. It's currency. And Julia's was screaming. Craving's jokes flew every hour. Compliments about her glow landed soft but intentional. One comment about her not touching the wine at dinner made the rounds 3 times in one night. Then came the look, not the dramatic kind. The slow blink, pause, and micro-head tilt Brandon got from Angela when Julia skipped the hot tub for the 3rd day in a row. And all Julia could do was laugh, deflect, swipe tension off her face, and try to play the character she's always depended on. Cool, unbothered, sharp-tonged. Except nothing was lining up. She kept pulling at her jacket without realizing it, even in degree lighting. Her arms folded high across her chest, no matter how casual the moment. She'd step behind counters while talking, stool legs, oversized purses, anything to block her profile. Even when she was seated, she'd shift slow. Like movement itself was risky. Everyone noticed. They didn't have to say it out loud. Especially Yara. Yara clocked it the fastest, not with judgment, but with quiet precision. One tilted head too long. One glance that lingered half a second more than it should have. One awkward silence between them in the kitchen. Julia reached for a water bottle and instinctively rested her hand on her lower stomach. It stayed there for one beat too many. Yara raised an eyebrow. Julia yanked her handbag like she touched a burner. And in that moment, her joke came out on autopilot. Plastic surgery, little tweak. You know How it is. Brittle smile, flash, laugh, joke over, but not forgotten. Julia still thought she was in control. That silence was strength. That privacy was precision. But everything around her was collapsing in slow motion. An emotional landslide of her own making. She wasn't protecting the truth. She was protecting herself. But it was backfiring. Fast. The lights in the studio hit different. This wasn't the safe discomfort of group scenes around a kitchen island or some semi-scripted poolside tension. This was a surgical floodlight of attention backed by hot mics, rolling cameras, and a dozen cast members waiting for the first awkward confession to crack open the day. Julia made it seconds. Shaw asked the softest question possible. How are you both? No trick wording. No trap. Just polite small talk. Designed to warm them up. And somehow that was the moment. Everything unraveled. Julia blinked once, twice. Her throat moved like she was trying to swallow, but no sound came out. Her lips parted and shut again. A whisper excuse about being fine. But then her hands started twisting. Her shoulders lifted, a silent flinch. Breath caught. And then the tears, fast, hard, not willing to wait for permission, she stood. No words, no eye contact, just a movement sharp enough to jolt the cast into silence. Within seconds, she disappeared behind the curtain. Cameras struggling to track the exit while the studio locked itself in a stunned freeze frame. What viewers saw in that moment looked like a meltdown, a public unraveling. Some even called it dramatic, oversensitive, or atypical. Julia. What they didn't see, what was invisible in that seconds was everything she held in for 6 straight months. Every doctor visit that ended with maybe. Every voicemail from her mom. Julia skipped because she wasn't ready to answer. Every conversation with Brandon that edged close to telling someone, anyone, and ended in heavy silence. Every shift in her body, she watched with quiet dread, wondering if safe would ever be a word she could believe in again. This wasn't some random spin-out. This was pressure with a blueprint. A delayed panic is shock on. A timer. Julia didn't collapse because she heard something that caught her off guard. She collapsed because everything had been shredding her from the inside for too long. And the tiniest trigger cracked straight through the surface. And Brandon, he didn't move. He didn't blink either because he'd seen it coming, too. He'd been sitting next to a woman, quietly breaking for weeks. And now he sat next to her absence. Empty seat, hot lights, a dry-mouthed host gently turning toward him like he held the answers. But Brandon didn't say anything. He didn't know how to explain 6 months of being supportive without being vocal, of being present without being proud, of holding someone's fears. Until your own hope starts to sour. He wanted to chase her, pull her back, say, "It's okay." But he stayed still because support for Brandon had been reduced to restraint. And this wasn't drama. This wasn't manipulation. This was a breaking point. Months in the making. It was never just the baby. Not the high-risk label, not the medical warnings, not even the unpredictable shifts in her body. What really scared Julia, what kept her locked in silence for 6 full months, wasn't what was growing inside her. It was what would come flying at her after she told the truth. Her mom's voice on the phone, her father's blunt questions. The weight of "why didn't you say something sooner," soaked in judgment Julia had been dodging since childhood. In her world, good news came with conditions, with scrutiny, with lectures. Wrapped in concern, but steeped in opinions she never asked for. And then there was Brandon's family. Sweet on. Paper, supportive from a distance, but his mom direct, not cruel. Just the type who sees a skipped call as a challenge. The type who will check on you whether you want her to or not. The woman who already had a strained dynamic with Julia, even before she'd unknowingly been kept out of a 6-month-long secret. It wasn't the secret itself Julia feared. It was the fallout, the faces in disbelief, the voices raised by love but punctured with hurt. It was the fear that someone would blame her if anything went wrong with the pregnancy, as if speaking it aloud had summoned the risk. It was carrying fragile joy while bracing for emotional backlash. People sling superstition like it's silly. But for Julia, it was survival. In her culture, in her family, early pregnancy isn't something you parade. You guard it. You protect it with silence and closed doors. Because too many women in her family had whispered about losses that came right after they told. And once that connection lives in your head, no fact sheet can erase it. So she wrapped herself in quiet, convinced herself she'd share when things felt safer. But the weeks passed. The silence stretched. And suddenly her own partner's parents were walking into a studio room with zero warning that they were about to become grandparents. Not at the dinner table, not with hugs and ultrasound photos, but under stage lights on camera. And Brandon wasn't just preparing for his truth to land. He was preparing for his mom to ask one question with her signature surgical calm. Why didn't you tell us? And Julia had no answer that wouldn't sound like betrayal, like weakness, like distance she never meant to create because she hadn't just hidden the bump. She was hiding from what came after the reveal. The rustle of the curtain wasn't loud. It didn't crash or rip open. It moved soft like linen on skin, like something unintentionally intimate. But for Julia, the sound cut through everything. Her back straightened without her permission. Her fingers locked then trembled. Across the couch, Brandon flinched, not visibly, but emotionally. Like every blood cell in his body just knew something irreversible was happening. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They both felt it. This was it. Months of secrecy. Months of saying soon. Months of moving through ordinary life with a secret that grew quieter the bigger it got. And now there were no walls left to hide behind. No soft let-up, no fade-in. Brandon's parents were walking into the studio in 3 steps. And they knew nothing. Not about the baby, not about the risk. Not about the silence he'd kept in there. Direction. Not about the sleepless nights. The modified routine. The lies of omission stored in text threads he never sent. Julia's breath picked up too fast, too shallow. Her palms flattened against her thighs like she could physically hold herself still. Someone across the set whispered something. A producer adjusted their headset. Shaw glanced toward the entry. Every camera was quietly repositioning. It was like the entire studio was holding one single inhaled breath. But inside Julia's brain, chaos. She wasn't thinking about cue cards or lighting or frame angles. She was spiraling through a mental projection of every question they were about to ask her and realizing she had 0 prepared answers that didn't sound like betrayal. Why didn't you tell us sooner? How long have you known? When's the due date? Why did Brandon keep us in the dark? Do you not trust us? Did something go wrong? Are we not part of this family? Each imagined question sounded sharper than the last. And here's what hurt the most. Those aren't irrational questions. These aren't villains walking into the story. They're people, grandparents, family members who would have been excited if they had been included. The anticipation of their disappointment was eating Julia alive. This was no longer about superstition or tradition or staying emotionally safe. This had shifted into a place where every delay made the truth grow teeth, where well-meaning silence now looked conspiratorial, defensive, personal, and her partner. The man sitting in a way, but emotionally encased in cement. Brandon was staring straight forward, palms pressed together, muscles locked, his jaw so tight it looked like forming. Words might break it. He wanted to reach out, to squeeze her hand, to whisper that it was going to be okay, even if that would have been a lie. But he couldn't move because he knew what was coming was bigger than both of them. The weight of every unopened text, every dodged call, every time he said, "We're good," instead of, "We're scared." He wasn't just about to explain a baby. He was about to explain a cover-up to his mother, and Julia, already cracked from holding the emotional burden alone, was now seconds away from having every layer of her silence ripped wide open and interpreted through someone else's pain. In her mind, this was still about safety, about not exposing something too early, about protecting joy from being jinxed. But in that studio, her own logic would look like withholding, like distrust, like selfishness. Because people don't see anxiety, they see rejection, especially when they're family. And inside all of this, the scorching dread, the camera crew prepping to capture every glance, the host ready to gently pry it all out. A worse fear started to brew under Julia's panic. What if Brandon turns on her? What if in trying to cushion his parents' shock, he draws a dotted line from her silence to their pain? What if he doesn't stand beside her in those next impossible minutes? What if love becomes blame? Brandon had already carried so much without asking for sympathy. But even resilience has limits. And sitting here moments away from confrontation, Julia couldn't tell if he still had anything left in him to protect her from what was coming or if he'd been holding it in for too long. Because she didn't just fear his parents, she feared his reaction to his parents. What would he say? Would he claim this was her choice? Would he try to soften the blow with sentences that left her exposed on her own? Would he hold her hand under that light or step inches away to protect his peace? That unknown was nearly as terrifying as the curtain itself. And for Brandon, the internal war had already begun. He's a son. He's a husband. He's a soon-to-be father. And those identities, once something he wanted to celebrate, now felt like angers pulling in opposite directions. He knew what his parents would feel. Not anger, not hate, hurt. That creeping sharp-edged grief of being excluded from something sacred. They loved Julia. They respected boundaries. But this was not a boundary. This was distance. Unspoken, unexplained, out of reach. And for every step his parents took toward that studio entrance, Brandon could already feel the hole it would rip into their trust. Could he fix it? Maybe. Would Julia ever recover from it? He didn't know. And he didn't have the strength to choose sides. Because in love, there isn't supposed to be a side to choose. But that's what this moment was constructing under his feet. A courtroom with no lawyers, just raw expectation, and two people silently bracing for judgment. Shaw glanced at her cards. The cast sat still, suspicious, but cautious, eyes jumping between Julia and Brandon, like the uneven breathing between them might explode without warning. Another whisper by a producer. Another shift of fabric from backstage. The entire room was silent except for Julia's heartbeat. She could hear it in her throat, in her chest, in her hands. She closed her eyes. For one last second, a second to ask anything for stability, internally. Begging the moment to slow, to give her a fixed point to stand on. But the truth, it wasn't waiting for her anymore. The truth was walking into the room and it had no patience left for their silence. Inside Julia's mind, there was no script, no clean sentence to open with. No soft landing, only noise. The kind of noise that doesn't come from the outside, but from inside your own chest. Guilt hammering against panic. Panic tangling with love. Love crushed under tradition. Tradition. Stabbed through by fear. No moment in her life had ever felt this compressed. This exposed, this wrong. Even while trying so hard to do what felt right. Because she wasn't scared of being found out, she was scared of being misunderstood. To someone on the outside, it looked like control, the kind you use to manipulate the narrative. Withhold the big reveal like a reality show twist. But to her, it was survival. Every time she opened her mouth to maybe possibly share the truth, her brain ran full speed through every version of how someone might receive it. And none of those versions looked safe. Some looked sharp, some cold, some flooded in disappointment. Each one distorted her confidence until staying quiet felt like self-defense. Because so much about what she was carrying didn't come from this pregnancy. It came from what she'd carried her whole life. A father who believed emotions made you weak. A mother who taught her not to share good news too early because it invites bad luck. A family where joy was always private until it was guaranteed. And even then, maybe not. Where even early relationships were hidden until they turned into rings. And where anything fragile, especially pregnancy, was considered sacred by default because of how easily it could vanish. Julia wasn't following a superstition. She was responding to generational survival tactics. And now, every choice that brought her to this point looked suddenly unrecognizable. She didn't keep secrets to be cruel. She didn't hide because she thought people couldn't handle it. She hid because she couldn't. Because telling people meant dealing with the ripple effect with calls, questions, advice, offers, side eyes, timing critiques, and conversations. She wasn't emotionally built to manage. Not in month 2, not in month 5, not now. She'd convinced herself that silence was safer for the baby, for her mental health, for the relationship. But safety over time looked a lot like distance, and the damage was catching up. Her hands, now back on her lap, wouldn't stop twitching. She could feel her foot brushing against Brandon's. Still, no words passed between them. But the emotional static between their bodies was screaming. What Julia didn't realize yet was that while she'd been spinning the scenario of worst-case emotional backlash in her head, Brandon had been doing the exact same thing. Different fear, same sinkhole. For Brandon, it wasn't tradition or trauma framing the silence. It was pressure. Pressure from being raised in a family that values honesty, even to a fault. Where updates are expected, not asked for reluctantly. Where being quiet is fine until quiet becomes deceit. And now that weight was all on him. He didn't hide the pregnancy out of cowardice. He hid it out of loyalty to a woman he loves. A woman he knew was scared. A woman carrying something fragile both physically and emotionally. And still he lied by omission. Not once, not twice. But every time a phone buzzed and a conversation was dodged and a visit postponed, every time his mother asked how Julia was feeling and he edited the truth with a soft chuckle and a hand wave. What would his parents think of him now? Not as a partner or a father-to-be, but as a son. What would his siblings say? What would happen when they found out that he, the one who always talked about transparency, responsibility, pride, had let a 6-month secret sit in his pocket, quietly hoping it would stay calm long enough not to explode. But lies like that have an expiration date. And it wasn't just the risk of being found out anymore. It was being reframed. As selfish, as shady, as disconnected from the family that had spent years trying to help him put himself back together after every rough stretch of his past. How does he ask them to understand something he doesn't know how to explain? Because on paper, the logic is flimsy at best. We didn't tell you. Because we were scared. We wanted to wait because of stress. We thought we had more time. None of it erases the one unavoidable feeling at the center of it. All, being left out. And now he and Julia had to walk back into that fire. Knowing full well that silence might have saved them from the noise, but it wouldn't save them from the consequences. Brandon tightened his jaw, sucked in a small, uneven breath. This wasn't going to be a confrontation. It wasn't even going to be anger that he could have handled. This was going to be disappointment. Sharp, quiet, lingering. Disappointment from the two people he'd wanted to make proud more than anyone else. He glanced sideways. Julia still hadn't moved, her hands now clenched so tightly, her fingers were turning red, her chest barely rising. She was still hoping for a grenade to turn into a candle. But deep down, they both knew the kindness of their intentions wouldn't soften the shock of their decisions. Because silence doesn't guarantee peace. Shielding someone from judgment doesn't erase the cost of keeping them in the dark. Fear may have planted the secret. Love may have watered it. But secrecy grew. Roots. And roots once ripped tear everything around them. They weren't unkind. They weren't malicious. They were afraid. Afraid of the wrong question at the wrong time. In the wrong mood from the wrong person. But those fears didn't prevent the damage. They postponed it. Julia tried to breathe deeply. Failed. Try it again. This is what secrets do when they break open in the light. They don't burst with a bang. They crack slowly. And you feel every single fracture. They thought they were saving peace. But even secrets told in love leave cracks when they hit daylight. Julia sat on the edge of the couch like she didn't trust it to hold her weight. Hands clasped, shoulders curved and tight, breathing shallow. Not a single muscle moved unless it had to. You'd think the cameras were off the way she refused to look at anything but her own knees. But they weren't. Not for a second. Brandon sat beside her, eyes fixed ahead. But every part of him was restless. His foot tapped just a little too fast. His hand twitched every few seconds like it wanted to reach for her. Maybe do something, anything to help steady her, but he didn't. Restraint had become his default setting. The cast felt it. Even the loud ones went quiet. Angela folded her arms like a spectator seconds before a courtroom bombshell. Yara wasn't talking at all. The host paused longer between her words, using a softened voice that was meant to sound careful, but only made the tension worse. Producers near the edge of the set were already whispering to each other. They knew something seismic was about to happen. They were ready to shift the segment, roll the tape in a different direction, step in if they had to, but no one moved yet. Because in moments like this, real reality takes over. Not reality TV, not storyboards, actual human implosion, the kind you only catch when you stop pretending and start watching closely. But before anything else breaks, before the words come or the confrontation begins, or someone finally stands up and says what no one's dared to say yet, stop. Pause the scene. Zoom out. Because this moment isn't just about Julia's breakdown or Brandon's loyalty or missed phone calls, delayed announcements, or who knew what when. This moment is bigger than one couple's secret. This is the fallout zone of thousands of small, quiet decisions that so many people make around love, fear, hope, and control. Because sometimes the thing meant to protect your peace becomes the exact reason you lose it. What do you do when the silence you thought was keeping things steady starts pulling everything apart? Julia thought she was protecting herself. Brandon thought he was protecting her. Together, they thought they were protecting the baby. But behind every silent choice was a louder cost, and those costs are now piling up in emotional receipts they never planned to pay. So, here's the harder question. When does support start becoming silence? Because love isn't supposed to make you small. It's not meant to shrink you into the background or gag your honesty to keep someone comfortable. Love without openness rots slowly, quietly. And by the time you notice the smell, it's already made a home in your bedroom, your text messages, your mirror. This isn't about blaming Julia or Brandon or anyone in their shoes. This is what happens when people carry fear like it's a responsibility. When they wear anxiety as armor, when they treat vulnerability like weakness and start building emotional bunkers instead of bridges. And maybe you've been there, too. Maybe you've told yourself you'd open up when it felt more stable. Maybe you've withheld good news because you didn't want the pressure that came with it. Maybe you've convinced yourself that silence is somehow less hurtful than honesty said too soon. But then it happens. You wait too long. The moment passes, and even though your heart was in the right place, the truth arrives late enough to feel suspicious, even if it never meant to. So, how do you come back from telling the truth too late? Is there room for repair without resentment? Can love survive the feeling of being left out of something sacred? Can fear still sit in the room without being the one driving the story? That's what Julia and Brandon are about to find out. Because today's story isn't about a pregnancy reveal or a breakdown on stage or even about whether parents were told on time. It's about trust. How it's built slowly, choice by choice, gesture by gesture, and how once it cracks, you can't fix it by quickly taping it back together. You have to earn it with discomfort, with honesty, with real effort under terrible lighting and too many witnesses. Julia shifted slightly on the couch, just enough to breathe deeper. Her hands were still clenched, her face still pale, but her eyes lifted for the first time since the curtain moved and locked softly on Brandon. His jaw relaxed. Nothing was said, but something in the air shifted. The fear still there. The pain absolutely present. But so was the choice. A choice to talk or walk away. To face what's coming or keep folding under the weight of what already happened. And every viewer watching knows the truth is still hanging in the room. Not yet spoken, but closer than ever. They've run out of room to delay, run out of exits, run out of distractions. All that's left is the reveal. And if you thought this collision was the end, wait till you see what happens when Brandon's mom finally hears the truth. That story is coming next, and it doesn't end the way fans expected.